Well, good afternoon and welcome to our RSK Biosenses First Thursday Club for September. I'm Gavin Wilson. I'm a director in RSK Biosenses and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Ewan Chan and Emily Lee from our RSK sister company Nature Positive. And I suppose what is a slightly different type of topic for our First Thursday Clubs, the consideration of human rights in relation to construction and infrastructure. Okay, so by way of introductions, Emily joined Nature Positive last April, having previously been the Director of Human Rights and ESG Reporting at Haleon. She has over 12 years experience working in consultancy and in-house roles across retail, energy, tourism and agriculture, as well as for not-for-profit organisations such as UNICEF. She provides expert advice and support to organisations to ensure that they meet their human rights and their responsible sourcing obligations in line with United Nations guidance. She is currently the Head of Human Rights at Nature Positive and is responsible for leading RSK Group's Human Rights, Modern Slavery and Social Value programme. Ewan joined Nature Positive in May of this year as a Senior Human Rights Consultant after working with SMEs and large multinationals on sustainability and human rights. Ewan supports clients as well as our own organisation with human rights due diligence. His main areas of focus are on supply chain risk assessments, supplier action plans, data analysis and employee capacity building. And thank you both very much for giving this session today. So Emily, if you could click to the housekeeping slide, that would be great. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. So the microphones will be muted throughout the talk, but you can ask questions via the questions box on your screen. And please do so because there should be time at the end for some discussion. And then shortly after the end of today's session, you'll be sent a short questionnaire by email. And if you do have a few minutes to provide some feedback, we would really appreciate it. It helps us to understand what works, what doesn't work with these webinars and what you, our industry colleagues, would like from them in the future. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emily and Ewan to tell us about why human rights matter to construction and infrastructure and how ecologists can protect them. Okay.
Great, thanks Gavin. And we're just going to turn our screens off while we present and we'll put back on for Q&A. So great to be here today, everybody, and yeah, thank you for joining this session. And as you would have a little intro to you and myself, we're going to just tell you really quickly a little bit about Nature Positive as well. So we're a global environmental and social sustainability consultancy, and our mission is to make sustainability second nature for businesses. And what we believe makes us a little bit unique is the way we bring together the three disciplines of nature, climate and human rights, which are often treated separately. But we know these issues are deeply interconnected, and we really try and help organisations address them in a joined up way, which is really timely for today's session, bringing together kind of environmental and social considerations in construction and infrastructure. So we're looking at beyond risks. We're really trying to help you uncover the opportunities and make that positive difference for the planet, for communities and for your businesses. We have a wide range of services. I'm not going to go into the breadth of these today. But if you want to learn more, we're of course really happy to talk to any of you after today's session and look at what we can help you with. So today we're going to cover a little bit of an introduction on sustainability and human rights, recognising this might be a new topic for many of you on the call. And we'll also talk a little bit about business responsibilities and the construction sector's impacts on human rights. We've got a couple of real world examples that hopefully bring this to life for you. And then most importantly, we'll kind of finish up on what the role of ecologists and construction professionals could be in protecting and respecting human rights. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ewan, first to talk about sustainability and human rights. Over to you, Ewan.
Thank you very much, Emily. And yep, so firstly, we're going to be talking about what exactly do we mean when we're talking about human rights. So at their core, human rights are the basic freedoms and protections that every single person is entitled to. They are universal, they apply to everyone, and they're also inalienable, which means that they cannot be taken away and they cannot be divided. So this means that they're all interconnected and equally important. So the foundations of today's human rights system goes back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. And this document really sets out 30 fundamental rights that have shaped the modern human rights framework. These principles were then expanded through international treaties, such as the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And more recently, we've actually seen the rise of various business frameworks, such as the UN Guiding Principles, the OECD Guidelines, and the ILO Conventions, all of which set out clear expectations for how companies should respect human rights in practice. But human rights aren't something that's separate from sustainability. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, makes it very clear human rights actually underpin sustainability. So as you can see on screen, the right to health connects with SDG 3, the right to food and water links directly to SDGs 2 and 6, and the right to decent work is the basis of SDG 8. And the right to a healthy environment underpins SDGs 13 and 15. So when we're thinking about sustainability, we're not just talking about the environment or economics, we're talking about protecting human rights. And that's because without human rights, there is no sustainable future. And businesses, including those in construction and ecology, are recognized as having a really key role to play in making those rights a reality. So the global foundation for business and human rights is set by what's called the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD Guidelines, as you can see on screen. Both make it very clear that companies must embed human rights in their decision-making processes, identify and address risks, and provide remedy and make right where harms occur. This responsibility goes beyond simple legal compliance, and it also cannot be offset by philanthropy or social value programs elsewhere. So bringing this into the construction and infrastructure space, these expectations are reinforced by further sector-specific standards, such as the IFC performance standards that sets requirements on labor rights, land acquisition and resettlement, indigenous peoples, and environmental and social risk management. And then there's also the Equator Principles that's adopted by over 100 banks worldwide and requires projects to meet these standards through due diligence and meaningful community consultation in order to secure financing. So taken all together, these frameworks send a really clear message, which is that businesses, especially those involved in construction as well, are expected not just to avoid breaking the law, but also to actively respect human rights as part of how they plan, finance, and deliver projects. So now we're going to be looking specifically at how construction and the work of ecologists intersects with human rights, and I'll be passing this section over to Emily.
Thank you, Ewan. So you're touching on construction, it has impacts not just on the natural world, but directly on people. And so if we look at these two sides together, it's widely recognised that construction can have many positive and negative impacts on communities, but it's definitely important to see how the impact on people is twofold. On the one side, there are the direct impacts on people through the work, so unsafe or unfair working conditions, like wages and working hours, or health and safety concerns. And it could include, severe risks like modern slavery or labour exploitation. And on the other hand, people are also affected indirectly through environmental impacts. So construction pollutes air, soil and water. It could disrupt or destroy habitats and drive biodiversity loss, and adds to climate pressures. And these ecological harms cascade into human rights issues if they are not addressed appropriately. And for example, polluted air and water undermine the right to health. A loss of farmland, fisheries and biodiversity can threaten the right to food, water and livelihoods. And climate change and displacement undermine the right to life and security. And when ancestral lands or sacred sites are lost, communities can also lose their right to cultural and self-determination. So construction impacts people in two ways, directly through the working conditions and indirectly through environmental harm. And seeing both sides gives us the full picture of risk. And to illustrate the environmental and social impacts that can happen because of construction, we have chosen a couple of case studies. Just to kind of reiterate the point first though, that in 2022, the UN recognised the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment for the first time. And whilst before that many people talked about it, it was never really recognised in this formal manner. And climate change is definitely the biggest threat to that right. Construction is a major source of emissions, whether that's through the supply chain or cement, steel and energy use. Climate undermines health, food, water and security, and can exacerbate the risks like forced migration and modern slavery. And it's estimated that by 2050, 1.2 billion people may be displaced due to climate impacts. So this is a really important issue for us to consider. And it's not just about emission targets, but it is also about human rights and how we address those. So I'm going to hand back to you and going to give a couple of examples to bring this to life. Over to you, Ewan.
Thanks very much, Emily. So in terms of illustrating this sort of connection, the first case study we're going to look at takes us to India, where the Bodhghat hydroelectric and irrigation project was proposed in the Bastar district. So on paper, it promised power generation and irrigation, but for local communities, particularly those within indigenous tribes and ancestral areas, it really represented something quite different. It represented more than 50,000 people fearing displacement from ancestral lands. It also represented about 14,000 hectares of land being submerged, which would mean wiping out fishing grounds, farmland, and grazing areas that entire livelihoods depend on. So despite the project not being fully underway, tensions are already rising in the area. Communities are fearing the loss of their agricultural and ancestral land, the wildlife that they lived alongside with, and ultimately their way of life. And thousands have already come out to protest the project. And yet, with limited clarity on the true ecological impacts, as well as ambiguity from the government about the project scope, the future of the project at the moment remains uncertain. And what this shows us is powerful, which is that environmental damage is never only ecological. When habitats are lost, human rights like the rights to food, culture, and livelihoods are directly threatened. So the Bodhghat project case study highlights the inextricable link between the integrity of the environment and the people's rights to survive and thrive in that environment. The next case study we're going to be looking at, this one takes us to Norway. This one's chosen out of the Fosen wind farms in Norway. This is the largest onshore wind power project in Europe, making up over 150 windmills and costing around 6 billion Norwegian kroner. The main risk of this project was that the large utilization of land for the wind farm would impact local community land rights. And this risk was eventually realized in 2021. So despite the project being operational, Norway's Supreme Court ruled the license for the wind developments as invalid due to the development violating indigenous Sami reindeer grazing lands, thus violating their cultural right of herders. This was because the wind turbines cut through the reindeer winter pastures, meaning that the reindeer won't go anywhere near the turbine park. So the local reindeer cooperatives now had to resort to feeding the reindeer from fodder over the winter instead of having the reindeer search for their own food in the area. And this goes against the traditional Sami culture and violates their right to enjoy their own culture, which is what the court ruled. So following this, an agreement was made for additional Sami land access that was granted. And this case study really shows that it doesn't require, severe environmental damage or forced displacement and violence against indigenous communities. It doesn't require these types of violations for human rights violations to still happen. And it's important to show that renewable energy developments must not be at the expense of local and indigenous community rights. So, having looked at these case studies, I'm going to pass over the next section to Emily on the role of construction and ecology professionals.
Great, thanks, Ewan. So really what we want to talk about now is how do we take what we know now in terms of some of the impacts of construction infrastructure, and what does it mean for you as construction or ecology professionals? And really, I guess the message we want to hit home today is sometimes you're often professionals on site, or especially if you're involved in an environmental impact assessment, you might be one of the first people on site. and have a real opportunity to identify gaps in processes or concerns that could help protect and respect human rights. So a couple of just really high level things you could do around assessing and consulting. So ensuring that impact assessments are thorough and the dependencies of local communities on nature are assessed, that free, prior and informed consent is upheld, especially where there are Indigenous communities concerned, and ensuring that products procured for construction are ethically sourced. So thinking about also what the materials you're using are and how they are sourced. Are there any kind of human rights concerns in those supply chains? Have you conducted a risk assessment of those supply chains to identify where more due diligence or controls need to be in place? And that looks at both environment and social impacts. Identify and query potentially ignored areas or rushed processes. So, where is an opportunity for you to identify where further stakeholder engagement would have been beneficial? Staying vigilant, spotting exploitation and reporting it. If you're on site, during a construction project or before, you might be able to help two different types of stakeholders. So if you're on site during, you might be able to help workers and spot signs of abuse or inappropriate equipment, training, or maybe they're appearing frightened or reluctant to speak. If you're there before or during, you might be able to help communities and identify where there's been a lack of engagement or consultation. You might also be able to identify where there are environmental impacts near homes, businesses or farms, and think about the knock-on impacts on those communities. And I think hopefully, you can identify that your role may be in some way, or someone in your business might be able to champion that participation. And how do you bring together ecologists, human rights experts and communities to have that meaningful participation and engagement to ensure that human rights are protected? So why does this all, what are the practical tools exist? We definitely don't need to reinvent the wheel. Practicals already exist and you might be already using these. So you might be doing impact assessments. Maybe you can consider gold standard human rights impact assessments that involve meaningful stakeholder engagement, or integrate human rights into your environmental and social impact assessments appropriately. Ensure that free, prior, informed consent and processes exist. There might be also opportunities to embed worker audits, spot checks on sites, and really importantly, making sure that grievance systems are available. And I think often these exist after projects kicks off, but if you can have a community grievance mechanism available from the outset, you probably hopefully highlight concerns before they become real issues for your projects. And really, I guess the challenge is applying them consistently and connecting them with your ecological findings as well. So why does it all matter for construction professionals and businesses? Respecting human rights could help reduce project delays, could help prevent protests, for that what you saw in some of our case studies, and also avoid litigation. Investors and regulators are also increasingly expecting due diligence as part of projects, so it might help you as part of those projects to meet those expectations. And ultimately, human rights risks are business risks. So the more that you address and prevent, mitigate and remediate human rights risks, the more you're reducing your business risks as well. Couple of just to recap a little bit here, what are the red flags to watch for? So with the community, really look for lack of consultation. As practitioners, being alert to these might help resolve or prevent issues, going further. Making sure that grievances haven't been ignored. Maybe you're able to spot where workers might be exploited, where there might be a lack of contracts or underpayments. There might be visible fear that you can identify in the workforce. And when it comes to the environment, thinking about what the destruction of habitats or water scarcity or pollution might mean on the wider community that are near those sites. These are all significant human rights and signals that human rights might be at risk and further investigation might be possible. A couple of key takeaways then. So I guess we want to hone into that human rights are part of sustainability, that construction impacts people directly and indirectly, to really think about not those more obvious issues, but where there's an indirect impact through an environmental issue. And that you as an ecologist or a construction professional play a really critical role on the front line. You know, either you're on site before, you know, as one of the earlier people in a role, so you might have opportunity to identify issues really early on and flag them, or you might be there during the life cycle of the project. And I guess hopefully you can see that you have a real opportunity to help protect ecosystems as well as protecting human rights. And I think that's what we really want to hone in today, is why your role can really matter. And you know, if you want to learn more about this, you want to have a conversation about it, Ewan and I have just said our email is up on the screen there. Really happy, and we'd really love to hear your reflections and questions now, and think about how this connects with your work and how we can support you in putting these principles into practice. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Gavin back to share his camera as well. And we have time for Q&A.
There we go. Are you guys going to join us? There we go. There we are. Great.
Hello.
Hello. Well, thanks both very much. You know, I said at the start that perhaps this isn't a typical topic for this webinar series, but you know, it's so important, and it's relevant for us working in our environmental jobs and environmental roles to have this wider awareness, I think. So thank you so much both for such an excellent overview. Like you say, we've got plenty of time. There's one or two questions in the box, and I'm going to go to those now. Okay, so I'm going to start with one about, okay, so it's how can ecologists and social scientists work better together? So I sort of presume that means, you know, ecology and construction and your area of social science feel like really quite separate disciplines that currently don't interact much.
That's a really good question, Gavin. Thank you. Ewan, do you want me to take this one, or do you want to have a go first?
Happy for you to take this one if you'd like to.
Great. I mean, I think the biggest message really was around by co-designing assessments. So how can ecologists and social scientists work together to maybe jointly define the objectives or the baseline indicators and methodology if they are doing an impact assessment? Maybe there's opportunity for kind of regular interdisciplinary workshops and kind of shared learning between ecologists and social scientists as well, and human rights experts. Maybe you can pair field visits together or share the kind of reporting that you do as a part of the project and help build that trust. And really, I guess the message is making sure that ecological findings connect to the community, maybe the livelihoods and the rights of those around. So I think, you know, that's where I would probably say they can work together more.
Great stuff, thank you. Okay, so there's one here that says, if I want to find out more about how to promote or protect human rights in our business activities, what is the best first step?
So I think the first step for any business is to really understand its operating context and really understand where it potentially has that positive and negative impact on people. And normally we start that with a kind of risk assessment, and that would be looking at your own operations and also your supply chain. So we often use the OECD guidelines that we talked about and the UN guiding principles and business human rights as kind of frameworks. And the part of that is because most international legislation, whether in the UK, across Europe or internationally, based its requirements on those two requirements as well. So it's a really good place to start in identifying in the kind of human rights due diligence cycle what you can do better and where your risks are. And if you're in doubt, I would have a look at the UN guiding principles. They set out a really clear way of measuring impact, looking at kind of scale, so how grave it is, how severe it is, the scope, so how widespread an issue might be, and also the concept of irremediability. So how easy is it to restore someone or situation to the former? And then you also kind of look at the likelihood of it happening. And so using that framework really helps you prioritize where the biggest issues might be and where you can take it further. At H Positive, we have developed a supplier risk assessment as well, who kind of look at inherent risks around like country and category. And a lot of companies will also begin there. So they'll look at the inherent risks of where they're operating, the type of business activity they're undertaking. And then that will help them kind of look, okay, these are the kind of few priorities where we know there's a real inherent high risk. let's go and do that on the ground research or stakeholder engagement or more meaningful research that really helps us understand what that risk looks like in more detail. And that's where I would start, is that piece. I think sometimes companies can jump the gun because of a piece of legislation diverting them to an issue, or because maybe a customer or someone has required them to look at something, but that might not be their most severe or most important risk to look at. So I think if you've done this risk assessment first at a high level, which helps you prioritize, you can feel confident that you're really addressing the issues you should, and you can put your resources in the right place.
Okay, great stuff. Yeah, thank you. All right, so we've got another one here. Okay, so with pro-growth political agendas to the fore, have you seen any evidence that human rights have been weakened within the context of infrastructure projects within the UK and beyond? It's a very relevant
Big
question.
Yeah, I love that.
We get into politics.
I mean, we definitely have seen some backtracking on legislation, as you know, with Europe as well, with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is currently going through conversations with what's called the Omnibus, and that's definitely, unfortunately, weakening some of the legislation. But actually, when we talk to our clients and their customers and suppliers, that isn't really happening in practice. I think people have already identified that there are real concerns. You know, globally, there's estimated to be 50 million people in forced labour and modern slavery, and construction is, in the UK, identified as one of the highest risk sectors for modern slavery risk. So it's really important that we don't backtrack. I think I've actually seen over the last few years an increased engagement on, especially in the construction sector, around workforce issues. I think where I'd like to see more emphasis is on the supply chain, and that is quite difficult because traceability and transparency is a really hard thing to work through, and often, you know, these supply chains are really convoluted, very complex, international, and I think that's why we say, you know, you have to prioritize. You can't do everything at once. So yes, the pro-growth it could backtrack the legislation, but I think in practice, I think companies on the whole are doing more.
Yeah, presumably training. Oops, sorry, Ewan, carry on.
No, it's all right. To add on that as well, despite the omnibus, there is still legislation like the EU deforestation regulation, as well as the EU forced labor regulation as well. All of these things are also going to be putting pressure on companies to understand their supply chains more. And yes, while the supply chain is, you know, sort of along the it's perhaps one step or multiple steps away in terms of risk for a construction business. Ultimately, that's still human rights violations along the supply chain can still impact ecology, can still impact communities as well. So I think the trajectory, as Emily has said, has already been set. There's a lot of customer pressure around this area, as we're seeing.
That's a really good point, actually, as well. So in the UK, for example, we've got the Modern Slavery Act, which has been around since 2015. And actually this March, we saw the first update from the government in terms of guidance. So the UK government released some new guidance around what is expected. And obviously that legislation is a reporting legislation. So there are definitely stronger laws elsewhere around due diligence, but they are definitely, I think, showing signs that we could see increased legislation in the UK in the future as well.
Okay, and presumably sort of, training and awareness for staff in companies is important in that context, particularly as things change.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Right, let's see what else. I think you might have answered this, but I'll read it out anyway. What steps can we take to identify potential human rights risks and issues in relation to materials, specific materials that we're sourcing?
Yeah, difficult one. I think, you know, often there's a lot of different materials that go into a site. So that's where I think this risk assessment piece comes in. If you're able to pull together that material list, you know, your common materials you're using on project after project, identify your kind of biggest spend areas, and do some research, you know, take the time to understand where those materials are made, where are they sourced from, what are the common issues you see. So are they mined? You know, is there a manufacturing process involved? What does it take to bring those to your site as well? Looking at transportation and logistics is also often forgotten about in the supply chain. And I think really understanding which of those materials poses the greatest impact to the environment and people, and then, you know, putting in place a consideration, okay, is there a better place to source them from? Is there a way that you can work with your suppliers to help them improve their methods and their way of producing those materials for you? And yeah, really just getting that understanding. I think some materials have been highlighted more than others to date because there's been more scrutiny, but I think, you know, really you kind of got to do the work to gather the information, you know, get that list together of all the materials that you're sourcing, where you're sourcing them from, and kind of understand those risks.
Yeah. Adding on top of what Emily's said, there's no lack of information around for what kind of risks can be present in what kind of commodities. You've got like the US Department of Labor's list of goods produced by child and or forced labor. While that's really useful, that kind of only scratches the tip of the iceberg in terms of potential human rights issues you could find along the supply chain. You could have issues like excessive overtime, discrimination, lots of other various issues as well. But the main benefit is, for us in terms of it, is that if you have a methodology that's consistent and repeatable, you can see how you're progressing over time in terms of you do one risk assessment, you then put in interventions in place, do another risk assessment afterwards, then you can see how things change, how things improve over time. So that consistent methodology is what we've found to be the thing that clients value the most and get the most produced out of. So just want to add that as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got one here. This looks like quite a big question to me, but how can we make sure the just transition towards a net zero future is really just?
I mean, it's such an important topic, and I've definitely seen the last sort of year or two many more webinars and conversations on the just transition. And I think, you know, for many years there was a bit of a halo effect with what we call clean renewable energy. And, you know, it's super important we do that. We really need to make sure that we are making that transition. But why should it be at the expense of workers in those supply chains? You know, is that, and I think, you know, no one wants to do that, but the problem is availability and cost often come into play here. The UK government itself earlier this year stated that it didn't want to meet its net zero goals through forced labour. So looking at solar panels, for example, hugely recognised a large percentage come from China, and the solar panel, you know, like the silicon has been linked to forced labour in the Uyghur region in China. So we know that these risks exist, and largely it's kind of gone unaddressed, I'd say, in the sector. We're not seeing enough action to diversify supply chains. So, you know, there's the issues when it comes to the manufacturing and the sourcing of, you know, the critical and conflict minerals that go into batteries for storage, for example. Huge issues there in terms of mined materials, conflict, child labour, forced labour. You know, the worst of human rights issues exist in these clean tech solutions. So the more a company can do to understand its risks and take action to work with their suppliers, you know, make sure you've done those assessments, make sure you've asked the questions to your suppliers. What do you have in place to prevent and mitigate these issues? How much do you know about where you're sourcing from on our behalf? And that you've also got to site, you've got someone who's gone to site. The audits, I think, still have a really strong place, but I think we see the increase of worker voice and tech tools talking directly to the individuals on those sites as much as possible, and potentially putting in place systems that are not like a one-time, you know, an audit has a great role to play, but it's a one-time moment in time, you know, on that site. Whereas I've seen some companies now be much more innovative, and they're doing regular like spot checks, pulse checks essentially on site, and they're able to track improvements. So they can ask the same questions on a biannual or quarterly basis and see, are they really seeing a change in what's happening? And then I think, you know, companies also need to recognise they might need to partner with organisations or NGOs on the ground near these sites as well, or work in kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives, because their leverage might not be there. They might be a really small part of a supply chain, and they ultimately can't address it alone. So you need to work with your peers, you need to work with these multi-stakeholder initiatives that exist. They already exist, they're already out there. So, you know, do some research about what's in your sector and see how you can work collaboratively to create the change we need. I think also, you know, recognizing that there is those site-based, we talked about the wind farm, you know, those kind of local community impacts are really important as well. So we don't forget that as part of the kind of just transition. You anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think the thing I want to add is something that Emily emphasizes a lot, which is with grievance mechanisms and whistleblowing. I think depth-based research in terms of what kind of risks are present in your operation or in your supply chains can only go so far. And the thing is, human rights issues will always be a prevalent risk, and working with your suppliers and with your staff to have grievance mechanisms and reporting processes that are trusted, transparent, and people feel that they're able to use it will really help businesses be able to keep on top of risks that manifest into issues, and also help to intervene before those issues become even worse. So I think that's probably like a really key step in ensuring that the transition is just, is having reporting tools to be able to get feedback from people who have experienced issues and resolving them and remedying them as quickly as possible. I would say that's probably quite important as well. Emily pushes quite hard about this, justifiably.
Fantastic, very comprehensive response, thank you. Yeah, we've got another one question here. So what role should professional codes of ethics play in the context of considering human rights? So I presume this is in the sort of industry, like construction and or ecology industries codes of ethics.
I mean, yeah, super interesting question. I guess if there is an opportunity, it'd be great if those codes, maybe these bodies that people are membership of, could explicitly mandate considerations of human rights as part of maybe ecological work. It'd be great if professional bodies could require that, and that you are able to report risks to vulnerable communities as part of those, you know, and maybe you have a responsibility to report ethical breaches. Maybe that's got to be part of this, is that, you know, we all have responsibility to report issues if we identify them. And maybe there's even room for things like peer review to ensure that, you know, the work is the best it can possibly be. I know we probably have that built in some ways, but yeah, I think the more we report, the better, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about in the sort of ecology in our chartered institute, it'd be one we could certainly sort of raise and talk to them about, see where they're at with it, what's in there at the moment, and yeah, I'm sure they'd be open to that conversation for sure. Okay, that's all the questions in the box. We're finished with a few minutes to spare, which is fine. It just leaves me to say a big thank you to both you, Emily and Ewan. Thanks to all of you for attending. And then just one for the calendars, our next First Thursday Club session will be on October the 1st, with the topic still to be confirmed, but we'll circulate that once we know the details. And that is us.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.